Our first speaker, Dr. Daniel Mcgehee, is the director of the National Advanced Driving Simulator at the University of Iowa and an associate professor of industrial and systems engineering, emergency medicine, public health, and public policy. Previously, he was the director of the Human Factors and Vehicle Safety Research Division at the University of Iowa Public Policy Center. In his capacity as director, he leads a group of faculty, staff, graduate, and undergraduate students in an interdisciplinary transportation research program that includes human factors, automated safety, and injury that is funded by government and industry. In 2015, Dan was appointed to be one of the 3 U.S. members of the trilateral U.S.-EU-Japan Working Group on Human Factors and Automated Vehicles. And with that, I welcome Dan and hand the floor to him.
Thanks so much, Dawn. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you yesterday, Lysandra, for a wonderful kickoff presentation. I recognize most of the names out there, so I think many of you know me. I want to thank Dawn and Jacob for putting this great meeting on. It's a pleasure to every day to be able to go to the NADS and work with such highly talented people and really know that we are making a difference out there. All of you are. So my talk today is going to kick off our presentations, but I wanted to kind of dial things back and give some perspectives that I'm noticing, especially in the media primarily, but sometimes among the scientific community, that we need to remember to go back to our roots. And so the talk today is called The Bounce Pass in the Automated Car. And as you know, when you play basketball, you practice the most fundamental elements, the bounce pass being one of those. And I have a little diagram here where there is a certain way to push the ball down with the excess of rotation and so forth. But there's also, along the same lines, a core set of fundamentals that go around advanced driver assistance systems, as well as more highly automated vehicles. And as we have many different discussions every day among our different colleagues and constituents, depending on where you work, some of these elements, I think, need to be sort of pulled out as being more salient than some of the kinds of language that is used in some of the public dialogues out there. So the challenge we face today is really the over-marketing of ADAS and automation capabilities. People tend to think that ADAS is more sophisticated than it is, as is the automation that we see in various demonstrations and testing regimes around the world. There's a lot of changing expectations of the motoring public that we need to be very aware of. And as we know, whenever there is an incident, and heaven forbid, a fatality in this particular space, it generally makes national and international news. And I think the NTSB, who's, as Lysandra said, is investigating all of these automated driving fatality cases. They have really been a pioneer in sort of setting the record straight about these things. So thank you, Lysandra, and your colleagues. So what we see in the many surveys that have been done by the AAA, My Car Does What, Iowa, and many others, the public is still really not that knowledgeable, even about the basic aspects of advanced driver assistance systems. And even developers and even service technicians sort of forget what the fundamentals of how these different systems work. Before I get too far, I wanted to first remind everybody that automation in the automotive context has been around for a long time. The first automatic transmission, now you don't really think about that as automation, but think about those of you that have driven a manual transmission vehicle. You know, in the early days of driving, you had to shift through gears, and the hydromatic drive by Oldsmobile was one of the first systems to automate shifting of gears. And one of the things when I was looking at sort of the history of these transmissions, what's really interesting, if you just Google the first automatic transmission, all of the images involve women. And this is really true later on when sort of making it easier to drive came to be as women started to drive vehicles. But it's still interesting to me that this was really the message in the 1940s, that somehow women were not able to drive a manual transmission. Later on, and many of you see me present this slide numerous times, 1958 was the first time that conventional cruise control, electronic cruise control came out, and interestingly, it was called Autopilot. And this also was marketed to women as footless driving, and I have another part of the presentation, another presentation that talks about the marketing of this technology to women as well. So when we actually go back to the most fundamental element is really what is automation. And many people conflate advanced driver assistance systems with automation. So when we go back to our dear colleague and the late Raja Parasuraman, he talks about automation in many different contexts, in aviation and rail, in driving before he passed away, but also in the manufacturing environment. So he described automation as really a device or system that accomplishes partially or fully a function that was previously or conceivably could be carried out partially or fully by a human operator. He also talks about sort of 10 levels, different than the SAE NHTSA context, where there is no assistance at sort of the number 10 level, and then the number 1 high level of automation. The computer decides everything, acts autonomously, and ignores humans altogether. So this is a better nuanced description of automation on that spectrum. And the language that Raja used in this particular article, I think is very useful as we continue on expanding automation at its higher levels. So when we sort of get back to the fundamentals, we have the operational design domain, which is really important in the sense that we have to look at the driving regime. So in flight, in commercial airplanes and other airplanes, you have sort of this complicated pre-flight checklist, taxi, takeoff, which is generally one of the more dangerous regimes of the flight, long, boring cruise, descent, landing, and so forth. But we also have a different direction that we look at driving. So we leave our neighborhoods where there are children riding bicycles and riding scooters, enter into perhaps 2-lane feeder roadways, into multi-lane, higher speed roadways, merging onto a highway or a freeway. But each one of those domains is very different in terms of when a particular system can operate. So it's important to consider these different driving regimes when you talk about the operational design domain, because I think one of the most common questions we all get is, when will there be automated vehicles on the road? And 99% of the time, what they mean by that is, when will a robot pick me up at my house and take me all the way to work, going through all these different kinds of ODDs. So it really challenges the SAE NHTSA levels of automation, because those levels don't consider the operational design domain. Again, keeping things simple, we need to remember that ADAS and level 2 looks over your shoulder to make sure that you are operating safely. So if you're distracted or get sleepy, a lane keeping system will nudge you back in. And when I say L2, there's a little bit of ambiguity, because sometimes we call about We talk about L2 plus, but by and large, general production ADAS systems are looking over your shoulder. When we get to L3, that system, essentially, you are looking over its shoulder as it operates in its particular ODD. And then finally, when we get to L4 and L5 production systems, there's no shoulder to look over in either way. And so concentrating on the operational design domain as we really talk about the future is really critical. And this, like I said, the SAE NHTSA levels don't really work very well, considering many of these systems that we see, like Super Cruise, for instance, only operate on a very narrow ODD. So getting back to SAE's definition of operational design domain, these are really the operating conditions that have a set of features that are designed to function only in those environmental, geographic, time of day restrictions, traffic and roadway, and so forth. So as we sort of take a look at the complexity of the drive versus the speed, we see sort of traffic jam assist, highway lane keeping as being really one of the more common sets of advanced driver assistance systems, a little higher, so traffic jam and stop and go traffic. We have parking assist, pedestrian detection, and so forth. So the more complex environments out there make for a much more sophisticated system to be able to respond. So for instance, if you just take a look at the Tesla navigation with Autopilot, it's primarily used in paved highways, slight curves and hills, has a speed range of slow and fast, fair terrain, day, night, and is not really looking out for pedestrians or stopped objects, as we are learning as we get more and more exposure to stopped vehicles being struck on freeways and more high-speed roadways. When you take a look at these slow-speed shuttles, however, they are very much in tune to the possibility of pedestrians, paved roads, flat, urban. The speed range is slow and slower, but only in very good weather conditions and so forth. If we take a look at sort of the next generation of cruise control, Cadillac has had for the last couple of years something called Super Cruise, and I hope all of you get a chance to drive this. It's a really beautifully done interface. Chuck Ford from General Motors led that particular design project. Many of you know Chuck. He's now retired from GM and works at MIT at Age Lab, where he's continuing to do a number of these highway automation and other Tesla-related works. Some refer to this as freeway automation, but it's pretty specialized. It only works on a specially mapped set of freeways where GM and their contractors have scanned very specific features of the roadway. But the key here is that the driver must keep their eyes straight ahead all the time. And on the lower right, I circled a little driver monitor, a little camera that looks into the driver's eyes as well as head position. And as soon as you look away from the road, you only get about 3 seconds before this display just above that circle turns different colors, flashes. So you have to really keep your eyes straight ahead, locked on the forward roadway all the time. So it's kind of a stretch to call this automation, because I've driven the system a number of times. And it's actually can be a little fatiguing sometimes to just spend all your time looking forward. To wrap things up, because we only have about 15 minutes each here, carefully review the hype as you see it and try to sort of decompose the different elements of the hype that you see out there. Bring that hype back to the basics. Our job really is to educate whenever we can out there, whether it's our neighbor, our students, constituents, other colleagues, and so forth. And also remember that ADAS and other systems are not perfect. There's a tendency for us to really think that these systems work all the time. One of the questions we had a couple of weeks ago is whether ADAS detects and will respond to deer that run into the roadway. Maybe, possibly, but certainly not all the time. Each of those conditions is very different, just like pedestrians stepping off of the curb into the path of a vehicle happens differently. And we've tested pedestrian detection systems. They work okay, but only under pretty specific conditions. And so we have to really know a lot about the limitations of these systems. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. Please send me an email, dmcgehee@uiowa.edu. Happy to answer questions at the end. Thanks so much. Let me stop sharing here.
Thank you, Dan. That was awesome. I really enjoyed being reminded of the history. I was just saying to someone yesterday that I've been my entire career in transportation safety. We've been looking at forward collision warning systems of some form or another, and they weren't new when I started over 20 years ago. I had a question for you about when you say get back to the basics. You and I have talked about some programs where students, like human factor students, don't just understand what the system says it could do, but actually start to dig into the system components and actually how they function. Is that part of what you're talking about, or did you mean something different?
Yeah, I think, well, I think there's two ways to answer that question. I teach an automated driving engineering course. And in that, we go through all of the different sensors, LiDAR, radar, computer vision, algorithms, all that kind of stuff. So it's important as a student to understand how each of those systems work independently and together. But I think more broadly, understanding how LiDAR works is not necessarily that important, but the fundamental issue is that LiDAR needs radar and computer vision systems as a backup because they all see something differently. And I think that's really the key, is redundancy in that context.
Thank you. I was just giving time for other people to form their questions, so I'll turn the floor over to see if anyone else has a question before we move on.
I can ask a question. I am allowed to ask questions if I can turn on my camera here.
Absolutely, please. And other panelists are also allowed to ask questions. Please jump in.
Hi, Dan, and thank you for the presentation. Maybe a philosophical question, but what do you think is the role of the media or the academia or government in addressing misinformation? I think I'm a little concerned that sometimes a lot of this hype is either driven by media activities or perhaps, I don't know if there's anything that we in our position can do or should do to address misinformation in addition to educate where we can.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think the challenge is that we are competing, our voices are competing with very big marketing machines, right? I mean, take a look at Tesla, which you know very well in your own work. The term autopilot, right, already conjures up, the German government and others don't allow them to use that term because of that concern. I think GM has done a more responsible job in the interface design that really requires the driver to keep their attention forward. But I think broadly, we just as researchers and policy makers, whenever we speak in public, and I know that many of you, I've seen many of you quoted in the newspaper or sometimes on television on NPR, that's the opportunity for us to wiggle in some things about these systems are still pretty young, and the real-time environment is complicated when you add pedestrians and bicycles and rain and all these other environmental conditions. These systems just turn off whenever it's raining, for instance. Whenever it's snowing, some systems turn off as soon as it gets to 32 degrees or 36 degrees in one system that I've tested. So there's all sorts of limitations that go with these systems that are kind of too complicated to go in every conversation. But at least if we can begin to wiggle in some of the challenges that these systems have in their early implementation, I think we can really move the needle.
So I see one more hand. Thank you, Dan. I see one more hand raised. Ben, we've got time for a short question before we move on.
Yeah, thank you. Really is a follow-up question from Elisaida. Maybe by observation. If we need to be clear with the media, in my opinion, as an engineer, probably a lawyer, is that everything has to be written, okay? Then whatever we present to the media is written, but it needs to be digested that they can understand technical terms so that they can use that as the main source of information. Once you start answering questions, then is when you have to be careful. That's my point. Do you have had any experience on what I'm telling you right now on the answering question? And if you agree with my comments, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think scientists, academics, and others really need to be able to talk in a way that doesn't use jargon. And I use jargon today because I all know that you know what an L3 system is, et cetera. But when I talk to the media, I would never use the word level 3. I might use an intermediate level where the driver is sort of looking over the shoulder of the system. And so those metaphors are deliberate on my part in this presentation, just so that we start to use a terminology that becomes easier to digest by the general public and the media.
Thank you. I am reminded of Lysandra's, something that I made note that she said yesterday about use plain language, but with technical accuracy, which I really liked. So with that, I think we're going to move forward. Thank you very much for your questions. And Dan, thank you for a very nice kickoff to our conversation today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Adam Schell. Mr. Schell is the Automated Transportation Program Manager in the Traffic Operations Bureau at the Iowa Department of Transportation. In this role, Adam leads and supports the Cooperative Automated Transportation Program at the Iowa DOT as it relates to policy, research, stakeholder engagement, development, and implementation of projects and initiatives in areas of connected and automated vehicles and intelligent transportation systems. Adam has 15 years of experience in transportation at the Iowa DOT, including program management, transportation planning, traffic forecasting and modeling, and geographic information systems. So with that, I'll welcome Adam and hand the floor over to you.
Thanks, Don. Just a quick mic check. You can hear me okay?
We can.
Excellent. Well, hey, appreciate the opportunity. I do want to make a couple quick remarks that we as an agency at the Iowa DOT have a very strong collaborative partnership with the University of Iowa, including Dan and his team over there at NAD. So want to, again, say thank you for the invite and opportunity to speak today, share a few things we have going on at the Iowa DOT and more broadly in Iowa, if you will, to get ready and support automated transportation. Maybe a little bit unique perspective. We refer to ourselves as an IOO or infrastructure owner operator. So opportunity to kind of give you an update here. A few things I want to go over include some of the things we're doing to get ready or organized as an agency, some of the stakeholder engagement we're doing, visioning and planning work. So we have some enabling policy and legislation on the books, which is pretty key. There's definitely a lot of discussion going on about the various various policy and legislation, patchwork, if you will, and we're trying to be consistent, or we have been consistent with some of the legislation out there by other states. And then kind of want to wrap up with some notable challenges and opportunities we're seeing as relates to the use of ADAS on our public roadways, especially in work zones. That kind of ties back in with what Dan was saying, and then the keynote presentation yesterday by Alessandra. So to kind of kick things off, I do want to start out by, defining what we mean by automated transportation. It's important to highlight the cooperative nature of it. Broadly, we see three primary areas of automated transportation. Again, from our perspective here in Iowa, as part of a multimodal transportation system, connected automated vehicles are obviously a critical component for use in the public roadway system, but it could include other things like air mobility, things like that, which our state peers are certainly talking about, and how they all integrate together to support mobility solutions. While roads, bridges, and other physical infrastructure are important to the transportation system, so too are other forms of infrastructure, those that are digital in nature, technology that supports communication, data, and the transmission of data to enable connectivity between, say, a traffic management center, the vehicles themselves, or the infrastructure. And then lastly, and often forgotten or not typically recognized, but critical component are institutional systems, such things as enabling policy that allows for the operation of automated vehicles, and other support functions such as roadway maintenance, vehicle registration, and titling. To kind of echo back to Dan's presentation, snow is obviously, being in Iowa, snowbelt state is obviously a huge topic, and one we hear from companies that, of the few things they look for, weather's obviously a big indicator. So with that, these elements of automated transportation aim to improve safety, mobility, and equity of all modes while supporting the communities, businesses, and travelers of the transportation system. So with that, as an agency, and frankly nationally, many states are discussing how to staff and prepare for the deployment and integration of many emerging technologies. To address this, some states are actually creating standalone innovation offices, connected and automated vehicle offices. At the IOOs, we don't necessarily have a dedicated office. I am the AT program manager. I am in the operations area within the highway division. My job day to day is to talk about the very stuff we're on the call here today. Pretty unique. There are other states that certainly have such a position. I've only been doing this for 3 years. As Don noted, I've been at the department for 15, so I have a pretty diverse background. But we are working to expand that capability, if you will, actually identifying this kind of work in actual requirements for positions. The motor vehicle division at the IOOs is actually filling an emerging technology program manager position, which will focus on things like a mobile ID, real ID, and then eventually the registration and titling of automated driving systems. So when it comes to internal coordination, we don't actually have a dedicated task force or committee, and instead we're kind of working to align on the topic of automated transportation within existing committees and working groups, as well as some other external and internal, if you will, kind of combination of working groups as noted here on the slide. So far, this approach has been successful and certainly could change over time. So moving on here, speaking of engagement, obviously real critical stakeholder engagement for us on the topic of automated transportation to ensure awareness of emerging technologies has been through our Iowa Advisory Council on Automated Transportation. We generally refer to this group as the ATC. Was created as the primary stakeholder group related to automated transportation. The ATC provides guidance, recommendations, and strategic oversight of AT activities in the state. The group first began meeting in July of 2018 and now meets roughly 2 times annually. Some of the subcommittees do meet up to about 3 years annually, which I'll get into here in a minute. But the ATC itself is chaired by Iowa DOT Director Scott Marler and includes a variety of stakeholders, as noted on the slide here. Many public and private groups, federal government partners, as well as our strong partners at the Iowa State University and the University of Iowa. And I should mention, we do have a website that we do maintain and do keep up to date and active. So early on, there were lots of discussions on how to best structure the ATC. We ended up with these 4 subcommittees as noted on the slide. The focus area of each subcommittee is also noted and listed there. Certainly some overlapping topics in some areas, including opportunities where we've collaborated between the subcommittees. But we do have two cross-cutting themes at the bottom there that extend throughout the 4 subcommittees that have been developed as working groups to support both the council and the associated subcommittees. Quick slide here just to kind of showcase some of the engagement that has occurred with various agencies and groups outside of Iowa. We've been able to connect with various state, regional, and national groups and associated association, as well as the private sector and industry, which is developing various automated transportation solutions. Oh. All right. So over the past few years, we've done some statewide visioning and planning efforts being pursued to document and support the deployment and integration of automated transportation. In March 2020, the Iowa AT Council completed the Iowa Automated Transportation Vision. This document serves as the state's roadmap for the safe advancement of automated transportation. I mentioned those 4 subcommittee and 2 cross-cutting working groups. They make up the 6 objective areas for the vision. We've identified roughly 2 dozen tactics, or activities that have been developed to pursue. A couple of notable ones I'll point out are ensuring cooperative automated transportation, or CAT, and planning. This tactic is essentially working to create a white paper on best practices for a variety of comprehensive and transportation planning best practices as it relates to the deployment and integration of emerging technologies. We've created the Capture AV Crash Data tactic is being supported through another working group that was recently kicked off, including leadership from the Iowa State Patrol and various staff from the Iowa DOT, something I'll get into in a little bit here later on. And then lastly, I do want to mention that through the ATC, especially engagement through State Patrol and Iowa DOT, we're having conversations related to some of the ADS testing items Dr. Lysandra Vega mentioned yesterday, such as identifying and reviewing safety and test plans, law enforcement interaction plans, and identifying a task force of key experts in the state when a company does want to come test in Iowa. We're also working to update our state long-range transportation plan, looking to include a no-hype summary to summarize the current state of technology, a right-sizing policy, which is a statement regarding consideration of emerging technologies in the planning and project development process. Because this document's only updated every 5 years and does look out with a 30-year horizon, it's things we definitely need to consider. And then the possible use of statewide travel demand model, which may include a potential scenario looking at impacts to highway operations, assuming some minimal adoption and integration of connected automated vehicle technologies. And then lastly, another plan that we have is a Cooperative Automated Transportation Plan, which is internal, was completed in 2019, specific to the Iowa DOT, and does align with our long-range transportation plan. It also identifies 24 actions which are associated with a generalized priority, cost, and suggested time frame. The difference with this particular plan is that we're not as broad as our AT vision, which is certainly looking at things like insurance liability and economic development, to name a few. So with that, I want to dive in real quick on the policy and legislation. In 2019, legislation was passed that removed the following distance requirements. We no longer have any sort of requirement in state code. This legislation did maintain a reasonable and prudent statute to following distance. Most notably, the bill didn't directly address automated truck platooning, but it removed following distance barriers to allow for automated truck platooning operations to occur in Iowa. Same year, the Eds Framework Bill was also signed into law in 2019, first time in our state's history, and provides a legal framework for driverless capable vehicles. The bill was based on model legislation from the Alliance for Automotive Innovation and does include both passenger and commercial motor vehicles. This does include or reference high levels of vehicle automation. So in the, not necessarily in code, but in the administrative rules, it does include SAE levels 3, 4, and 5. And the legislation areas are noted there on the slide there. I do want to mention that the legislation did provide the Iowa DOT broad rulemaking authority, and it's through this rulemaking process we have a new chapter in our administrative code, which does include an exemption process to test and operate an ADS-equipped vehicle on public roads. And ironically, this rulemaking is completed and does take effect next week on October 13th. Another interesting and notable piece of enabling legislation that actually was brought into session this year and then signed by the governor in May is the Personal Delivery Device, or PDD bill. You can see the new sections noted there on the slide, such things as definitions, operational parameters, and insurance requirements. It is worth noting that this particular bill is exempt from the previous ADS legislation that I mentioned before, because these PDDs are devices and not vehicles, so they're not subject to Iowa vehicle registration and titling. And I apologize, I don't have a picture, but obviously if you've seen these, they look like those cooler sized drones with wheels. So real quick, because I know my time's getting short, I do want to mention before I wrap up here, a few interesting crashes and incidents we've identified that involve the use of advanced driver assistance systems in Iowa and public roads. These crashes and incidents are examples of things we're working to determine how we can better capture this information in crash reporting, while also working to partner with other groups like NADS, Dan and his team, to better inform the public of ADAS features to support drivers. So this first example occurred in November of 2020 in the Des Moines Metro. So to be along duplicate routes, Interstates 35 and Interstate 80, which is in central Iowa. This crash involved an officer pulling over a vehicle. While doing so, another vehicle came up behind the officer and struck the officer's vehicle. The driver of the second vehicle that struck the officer was distracted, and as you can see in the slide, admitted to over-relying on the vehicle lane assist technology. Another example are a handful of crashes that occurred in April of 2021. This is about 20 miles east of Des Moines, capital city. It was on Interstate 80 as well. These incidents occurred in a work zone and involved newer model year semi-trucks with advanced driver assistance systems. Crash reports and driver interviews determined ADAS potentially had a part to play in these incidents. Discussing these incidents further internally, and as you can kind of see here on the slide, there are some assumptions that the work zone layout in the old edge line here relative to where the skip line is potentially played a part of the challenges in using ADAS in a particular work zone. Certainly things we're hearing recommendations from other companies that perhaps there's an opportunity to recommend that people turn off this feature in a work zone. And then lastly, my last slide here, the two examples of also occurring in work zones, both ironically occurred on the same route, but in different counties. The incident on the left involved a stationary maintenance vehicle with a trailer attenuator. A passenger vehicle with its ADAS engaged didn't stop or maneuver around the maintenance vehicle in time to avoid the crash and ultimately hit the maintenance trailer. And then the incident on the right occurred due to a temporary steel plate being used for roadway maintenance, and it caused the vehicle to apply its automatic braking, resulting in a bumper-to-bumper incident with the vehicle following behind it. So I know it was kind of a whirlwind of some examples towards the end there, but certainly things I personally have actually been engaging with Dan on, as well as others in the state. It's certainly an opportunity to continue to work to get organized and determine how we can collect, this type of information, which is frankly hard to get. It's hard to even be notified that they're occurring, but ultimately work to try to better inform the public, because we're learning that a lot of people don't even really realize when they're driving some of the confusion they're having is tied to the advanced safety features that are supposed to support them. So with that, I will stop talking. Hope I didn't go too long there, Don.
No, you're fine, Adam. Thank you. I am wondering, those plans, those strategic plans that you mentioned, are there links to them that we could get? Yeah. Okay, they're in the PowerPoint, and you have given that to me. Thank you. That was my question. Does anyone else have a question? I also see that Laura has put some links in the chat for us.
Yes, Laura they have some great info. Laura and her team have done a webinar that I have seen, and we are using your tracker, Laura. It hasn't gone unnoticed. In fact, I've shared it with our Bike Pet Advisory Committee, so FYI.
That's great to hear. Thanks.
You bet. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Don.
Thank you very much, Adam. So I think we'll just keep moving. Our next speaker is Tammy Trimble. Tammy, while you're bringing up your slides, I'll introduce you. Dr. Trimble is a senior research associate with Virginia Tech Transportation Institute's Division of Data and Analytics. Her experience includes over 18 years in transportation policy research at VTTTI. She has worked on several policy-related research efforts related to transportation technologies, including automated vehicles and associated education efforts. Her work exploring the implications of automation for motor vehicle codes was awarded the 2019 TRB John C. Vance Award, which recognizes outstanding contributions to the understanding and implementation of transportation law. Dr. Trimble holds an MPA and a PhD in public administration from Virginia Tech. She has completed the National Highway Institute Instructor Development Course training, achieved Virginia Tech Mastery of Online Instruction certification, and survey method training at Virginia Tech Center for Survey Research. So with that, I welcome you, Tammy, and I hand the floor to you.
Great, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here today and to share the space with the other speakers today. So today I'll be focusing on two of our recent research efforts that are really focused on preparing public safety personnel for automated vehicle technologies. So the first project identified first responder emergency response scenarios and interactions, while the second project resulted in curriculum recommendations for public service safety providers. So in the future, as we've discussed, vehicles equipped with automated driving systems that drive us instead of us driving them will become a reality. And these vehicles will integrate onto roadways and may change operational interactions with other vehicles in certain scenarios. Public safety officials such as law enforcement, fire and rescue, and emergency medical personnel routinely interact with a broad spectrum of public and private vehicles to protect people, to investigate crimes or crashes, and to save lives. So the Crash Avoidance Metrics Partners, better known as CAMP, funded and led fundamental research to examine emergency response scenarios for ADS-equipped vehicles. BTTI and UMass SAFE completed the technical work for this project, and I'd like to recognize them as well. So this research effort determined the common scenarios where public safety officials must engage in several different interactions and interaction types with a broad spectrum of public and private vehicles today. And this was determined through a literature review and working with subject matter experts in the first responder community. We also wanted to understand the protocols used during those scenarios and the associated interactions, and whether factors such as weather, roadway type, geometry, or vehicle type impacted current protocols. So the team analyzed and broke down the tasks of each scenario step by step. We then held focus groups and interviews to verify the information was accurate, or at least flexible enough to consider all variations of how an operation may be conducted. The final step was to ask public safety officials how their operations may change due to the introduction of ADS-equipped vehicles in driverless operations. So there were 961 jurisdictions contacted between the US and Canada for this study. This resulted in focus groups and one-on-one interview participants from 22 US states and 3 Canadian provinces, with a total of 79 participants, 51 in the focus groups and 28 as part of one-on-one interviews, and they covered a range of domains that you can see listed here on the slide. In general, we found that prior experience with autonomous vehicles was low. A third of the respondents indicated that their departments had some form of experience, either via conference attendance or general awareness, while 2/3 did not. Individually, only 6 participants indicated that they had any personal experience with autonomous vehicles, and this was typically by attending a conference about the vehicles and not specifically owning, operating, or interacting directly with these types of vehicles. So, as I said, a literature review and discussion with public safety officials were used to identify key operational scenarios, and we then conducted a hierarchical task analysis to review these operational scenarios in more depth. As shown on this slide, responding to an incident, securing a scene, and traffic direction and control scenarios are shared across the 3 public safety domains of law enforcement, fire and rescue, and EMS, and 3 other scenarios were domain-specific, traffic stops and checkpoints, and abandoned or unattended vehicles for law enforcement, and stabilization and extrication for fire and rescue. We also identified 3 broad types of interactions that may be had with vehicles. Direct interactions were identified as any interaction when a public safety official needs to come in direct contact with a vehicle, either physically or with a tool such as the jaws of life. Indirect interactions are those where a public safety official is conveying some information, direction, or command to a motorist without coming into contact. So lights and sirens, parking to block a lane, message boards, signage, or signaling with gestures. And then informational interactions are those where public safety officials extract data or information from a vehicle, scene, or occupant. And that includes surveying a scene for hazards, assessing a vehicle for the number of occupants, noting a license plate number, or requesting registration and proof of insurance from a driver. So additional information on these operational scenarios and interactions may be found in our published work, as well as the Automated Vehicle Safety Consortium's AVSC best practice for first responder interactions with fleet managed automated driving system dedicated vehicles. And I can share my slides that have the links to these in as well. So this research was really used to inform our most recent work, which was conducted for the Governor's Highway Safety Association with sponsorship from State Farm. And the objective of this research was to identify strategies for integrating ADS-equipped vehicles into the U.S. fleet without significant disruption to first responder protocols. In doing so, we sought to distill and summarize progress to inform and educate stakeholders on ADAS and ADS-related technologies. So this research expanded our previous research by adding in crash investigators who need to be able to complete the reconstructions and know what data is available to properly fill out crash reports. And it also included administrative personnel as well as the rank and file officers. We conducted this research in 3 parts. Part 1 included a literature review, again, of the state of the industry regarding ADS and ADS technologies. In addition, we included summaries of recent policies and recommended best practices for public safety providers. We looked at crash reconstruction and crash reporting methods and identified opportunities for the inclusion and tracking of rapidly changing technologies within these fields. And we included relevant portions of the literature review in the final report. Part 2 included discussions with government administrators, first responder and law enforcement organizations, automakers, crash reconstruction organizations, and insurance and safety advocates. These discussions explored and documented general training needs for public safety providers, as well as training channels and potential barriers. So by reaching out to a wide range of stakeholders, we were able to identify the areas where training was most needed. And then part 3 was a synthesis of these findings from parts 1 and 2 to come up with curriculum recommendations suitable for outreach and education. So just quickly, why is training needed? According to AAA, on average, every other week, a first responder is killed while working on a roadside across the US. And emerging technologies such as ADAS and ADS-equipped vehicles have the potential to make the roadway safer for all drivers, especially law enforcement and other public safety providers who spend hours behind the wheel and face increased crash risks when responding to emergency calls. However, and as this builds on what Dan talked about earlier, the understanding's not clear. We know from our previous work, and also it was echoed in this work, that the public safety providers' understanding of how what these vehicles currently do and how they will operate in and respond to situations is limited. Many are working in areas with limited or no ADS-equipped vehicles and have yet to be exposed to these technologies via training or conferences. Often their exposure is limited to the internet videos or television news coverage, resulting in incomplete knowledge or misunderstanding. For example, thinking that these self-driving cars currently exist. So because of the challenging nature of their jobs, training designed to reduce the uncertainty and temper expectations is desired. So basic training specific to ADS and ADS equipped vehicles in combination with first responder interaction plans will answer questions such as the ones I have listed, allowing public safety personnel to focus their attention on the other demands of their job. So in thinking about how the training should be provided, it's important to remember that training regarding vehicle interactions is just one of the many, many trainings that public safety providers are required to take. Overwhelmingly, stakeholders suggested that training be short, easy to comprehend, and highly illustrated with pictures and/or videos to help them understand what to expect from technology applications. And the materials must be engaging and convey how the public safety providers' jobs will be made easier and/or safer. And this may mean providing different training based on the various roles within an agency. And I think as we talked about before, they really need to understand the training that's being presented. So I think the phrase was plain language with technical accuracy, and we heard that as well. Looking at the approach, modular training starting with basic information and building to more advanced, looking at blended training, so a combination of online and in-person training, and where possible, experiential training, and when not, hands-on training isn't available, looking then at a series of short 5 to 10 minute videos with high production value that can serve as a surrogate. I know my time is short, so we'll just go quickly through the 6 areas that we recommended. The first area is understanding the differences between ADAS and ADS equipped vehicles. And this is really to provide that common understanding at the most basic level. So covering definitions and acronyms which are not widely understood. Building on that, while the purpose of the first is to provide that general understanding between ADAS and ADS, this module would explore ADAS technologies in greater detail. As these vehicles are presently on the road, it's more likely that the public safety providers would encounter an ADAS equipped vehicle than an ADS equipped vehicle. Next is understanding governmental responsibilities regarding vehicle oversight. This is not always clear to the frontline workers what each level of government's responsible for. So this module would clarify the responsibilities of the federal government, for example, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards versus state government agencies who are responsible for the safety of the driver, driver licensing, and the enforcement of traffic laws. This module would then be supplemented with relevant state and local enforcement authority related to ADAS and ADS equipped vehicles. The fourth module serves to reassure individuals that much like previous one-time novel technologies such as seatbelts, airbags, and cruise control, vehicles equipped with ADAS and ADSs will gradually be introduced and are tools for safer travel for all roadway users. For departments purchasing vehicles equipped with ADAS technologies, individuals should be trained on the features in their vehicles to clarify any misconceptions about their capabilities. And then the AV test initiative can be consulted to check for potential presence of deployments in their region. The fifth module would then provide an overview of these types of interactions that I discussed from the previous project and be supplemented with information from first responder interaction plans. And the final recommended area is looking at data, really providing an understanding of how what data is available, how that data can be accessed via the crash recorder or a dealership service system with or without a warrant, and how that data may be interpreted. So just real quick in closing, I'd like to provide 2 opportunities moving forward. So while it's important to train public safety providers on what to expect when interacting with ADS equipped vehicles, it's unrealistic to think that every provider will have the capacity to become an expert. So really looking for departmental champions who want to be engaged with this technology is useful, and they can provide training back to their peers. Also thinking about public-private partnerships, public safety provider liaison teams play an important role in the deployment. They interact with government and public safety officials where the technologies are deploying, and they can help first responders fill knowledge gaps about vehicle applications. I think my time is up. So I'd like to thank you for joining me. And this is just you paid attention to the end so you can see a picture of a cat. But thank you very much for having me and letting me share this exciting research with you.
Thank you, Tammy. By the way, I always like seeing cats, particularly on Zoom meetings. Cats are always welcome. So are kids and dogs, but you know.
Yep.
So I wanted to ask you, when you were first speaking, and it could have been my own mind, I thought you were talking about when safety personnel and first responders or emergency responders were responding to crashes. Did I imagine that, or were both them using these technologies and responding to these technologies part of your talk, or was I just in a mindset?
No, I think it's both. So in the previous project, we really looked at how they would interact with these technologies out in the field, and then thinking about the purchase of new vehicles that may be equipped with ADAS technologies, knowing how you may need to turn those technologies off or on, which is specific to the law enforcement vehicles, so that the automatic emergency stop doesn't engage whenever you're in pursuit or something like that.
That makes sense. And that was sort of a setup question for what I really wanted to ask you, but I wanted to make sure it wasn't silly.
Oh, no.
Are you seeing a different kind of receptiveness to training and these conversations about these vehicle technologies, whether it's from the perspective of you're going to show up on a scene and you might need to know these things about this technology, compared to this technology might be in a vehicle that you're operating? Are you seeing any differences, or is it about the same?
I think there's just a basic overall desire to have training that will clarify any misconceptions.
Okay. All right.
You know, will my vehicle stop? Do I need cruise control if I have automatic emergency braking, or will the braking act as the adaptive cruise control? So just even clarifying some of these basic points is desired.
Yeah. Some of the ordinary people I've spoken to were worried about some of these technologies like emergency braking or lane assist, or, you know, that when they were responding to an emergency, these systems might actually hinder their safety response, you know, like that they can tell what's going on in the environment better than a vehicle system. Have you run into any of that?
Yeah, I think that's a question that we've had is how will the systems interact? And we know that some of the law enforcement vehicles are set up a little differently so that some of the systems can be overridden if needed in certain situations. And
okay.
So I think that's a concern that's out there that would need to be taken into consideration in developing the training and information for the law enforcement or for other first responder when it's appropriate to use these technologies in their response vehicles. You know.
Are there any other questions? Okay.
That's a question. I know. Are we running out of time?
No, we're fine.
This is probably outside the scope of the research that was just presented, but I'm curious about some of the safety risks associated with some of the limitations of the system. So kind of training on the other direction. So for example, a vehicle responding to a traffic stop, you know, an automated vehicle responding to lane closures and things like that. Is there a need to train the safety community about that as well? Or have you had a discussion on along those lines?
Yeah, we actually have a demonstration project we're doing for DOT now that's looking at how vehicles will respond to more challenging situations, and that also includes construction and temporary work zones. And we have some for TRB, so we're thinking about how we would do outreach to those communities as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Tammy. I really enjoyed that. So I think we'll keep moving to make sure we stay on time. Our next panelist is Josh Domeyer. Dr. Domeyer is a senior researcher at the Toyota Collaborative Safety Research Center. He received a PhD in Industrial and Systems Engineering at the University of Madison, Wisconsin, just this year. Congrats, Josh. And a BS at an MS degrees in Experimental Psychologies from Central Michigan University in 2009 and 2011. He has been a human factors researcher at Toyota since 2011, where his research has focused on driver-vehicle interface, distraction, and human automation interaction. He joined the Collaborative Safety Research Center in 2017 to explore the communication between drivers and pedestrians with the goal of informing the development of vehicle automation. Josh is the chair of SAE's Safety and Human Factors Steering Committee and the U.S. expert on the ISO TC22/SC39-WG8 standards group. And with that, I welcome you, Josh, and I hand the floor over to you.
All right, thanks, Don, for the introduction. So at the beginning here, I'll just mention that I'm more on the research side of industry. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is kind of some research that I get to enjoy with some very smart people in vehicle pedestrian interaction across the country, actually. And really the focus of this research is not so much on detecting pedestrians, like you might hear from somebody that's on the technology side of things, but it's really about creating behavioral models to actually improve our anticipation of pedestrian behaviors, other road users generally. So I like to start talking about this topic as like looking back to when automobiles were first introduced, because there were some challenges that are very relevant for today. So at the time, we had to develop these social norms, infrastructure, new rules and guidelines for how people would share the roadways, because of course we went from horse and buggy to what we have now, which is vehicles that are far more capable than those that were first introduced. And one way that we can look at this is actually thinking about how people perceived vehicles at the time. And what you get to is that it wasn't just safety and efficiency that were really important, but pedestrians were particularly attuned to fairness and other considerations as the roads were slowly taken over by vehicles. And so we can use the same type of thinking to sort of anticipate problems that we might encounter with vehicle automation being introduced regardless of the level. And there's been a little bit of research on this. There are explicit signals, so you might introduce new lighting to help with the communication between vehicle automation and other road users. There's implicit signaling, which is kind of how we interact now on the road. We change our lane position or stop location depending on whether we're interacting with somebody. And then also there's this integration between these explicit and implicit signals, which might eventually enhance the communication that we already have on the road with these new vehicle technologies. So CSRC actually started some of this research back in 2016, or even before then we were talking about it. But really there's kind of been a few focuses here. One is using naturalistic driving data of how current road users interact. And we think this is really important for creating truly human compatible automation as we just try to figure out what road users need. We've applied novel methods like VR and pose estimation for vehicle pedestrian interaction. But mostly what I'm going to talk about today is modeling, and actually some really high-level concepts in behavioral modeling that are important for the way that we think about how we ensure that these vehicles are safe and treat other road users appropriately. And the way I've heard this conceptualized before is that this sort of mixed traffic environment is sort of a mosaic of different road users with different capabilities, including different levels of automation. And somehow we have to figure out how to get everybody to interact in a way that doesn't cause disruption to the traffic system. And that's really what I like about some of the talks today, is a focus on the system of interactions and not just the driver and vehicle, because that's kind of what my research has focused on. And there's two reasons that interactions with other road users are very important to safety. First is that by introducing automation, we might actually be shifting some of the types of errors. So if you think that most automation currently works at this sort of operational level, so it's reacting to the environment, we might see errors emerge in sort of strategic decision making, like some of the talks talking about vehicles running into emergency officers, and that's partly because they don't move over, right? So there's a tactical or strategic decision there being made to mitigate the risk. And then the second way, and this is primarily how I've conceptualized this, is that if we undermine acceptance with other road users by taking the right of way when it's not given to the vehicle, or we just treat other road users poorly, this will lead to lower acceptance rates and eventually people disliking the automation. And there's a few examples of this in the media already, even with the vehicles that have safety drivers. So this is what I'm used to looking at, is kind of these single vehicle, single road user interactions. And this is great. It's good to finish a dissertation. But when I started thinking about this topic recently, as I wanted to expand some of my research, what becomes apparent is that roadway interactions often involve multiple actors that are situated in different contexts, as Dan talked about, different ODDs, and it can be quite complicated. The second thing that I'm going to kind of focus on in this talk is these tactical and strategic behaviors, and some of the ways that we might use them to accommodate other road users. And then the third thing is really how interactions might be interpreted differently by vehicle occupants versus automated systems, and how we can actually investigate the decision mechanisms of the driver versus the decision mechanisms of the automated system. And as I said at the beginning, the goal is really to make human compatible automation. And I like to draw this distinction between human-like and human compatible, because we don't always want automated driving systems to perform like humans do, if you think about the ways that distraction or other things affect people. So the first example I want to talk about are these multi-user interactions, road user interactions. And this is actually some work that we have going on with the MIT Age Lab right now to develop a larger data set of coded behaviors. And really the focus is on trying to figure out how pedestrians and vehicles in these interactions extract information from the environment to make decisions. And what we found in some of the early research before this even is that the rate of explicit communication through hand waving and eye contact is actually relatively low. And so understanding how pedestrians and vehicles move is very, very much the focus of this. And this also understates the role of competing sources of information. The reason that this is important is if you were to introduce some sort of new communication for vehicle automation, you might actually have unintended consequences if there's other road users in the interaction that interpret the communication differently. A second project that we have going on are these, what I think is really cool, a naturalistic study of e-scooter behavior. And on the right here is just it's not similar to the picture, but it's showing an e-scooter going alongside an equipped vehicle. And what's really interesting about this is that we can take the movements that I was talking about in the previous slide, and we can figure out how the vehicle and the e-scooter rider interact to actually create behavioral models so that the vehicle might better predict kind of the behavior of the e-scooter rider. And this project also involves a large data collection of different city scenes with e-scooter riders, where we're actually reducing the data, again, to create behavioral models, not to create prediction estimates. But it's really interesting because the different transportation mode affords different sorts of behaviors that are different than some of the pedestrian interaction work that I've done. A third project, and this stems directly out of my dissertation work, is actually to start to look at some of the time series interactions of drivers and pedestrians, so how drivers and pedestrians move at crosswalks, and to start to take apart these operational, tactical, and strategic behaviors. So you might think of operational as reactive, tactical as sort of anticipatory, and strategic as being maybe the route that you choose. And you know, strategic and tactical behaviors is actually what we should be aiming for, is either reducing the interactions altogether to create safer environments for pedestrians or other road users, or these tactical behaviors anticipating the needs of pedestrians and really pulling this out of naturalistic data. A third project that I wanted to talk about was this project that looks at the difference between an algorithm predicting the intent of the pedestrian versus participant ratings of when they think that the pedestrian will cross. And what's interesting about this study is that we actually have the responses of the participants saying what information they use to determine whether the pedestrian can cross. And so you can imagine a scenario where there's a discrepancy between what an algorithm thinks and what a rider of the vehicle thinks, where additional information is needed to ensure that the person in the vehicle feels comfortable with that interaction. And so this is really cool because it actually takes the tools of behavioral science and sort of applies them to these more nuanced scenarios where you're trying to interpret what an algorithm is telling you about the interaction. So really the question that I'm seeking to answer with this research going forward is, how can driving automation, regardless of the level, enter traffic ecology seamlessly and actually accommodate other road users and in fact improve their experience? So one is that we can learn a lot from current road user interactions. And as I said, human compatible automation is the goal. And really what we can learn from is how people anticipate risk. They minimize conflicts in more ways than just reacting to an emergent risk. They sort of anticipate them ahead of time. And then we can learn at what interventions they use to actually mitigate that risk. A second thing here is really a lot of my research has talked about the metrics that we use to that are important for quantifying the effect to other road users. And it's really more than just safety and efficiency. It includes things like acceptance, comfort, and trust. And this is a lot more difficult to quantify, obviously, but it's necessary for creating vehicles that are accepted by a wider group in society. And then the final thing is that by understanding actually the underlying mechanisms that road users use to communicate can help create new, maybe machine learning features, but also engineering criteria for how these interactions should pan out, actually. And so these might serve to create more human compatible automation. I'll just thank everybody that kind of has been involved in this work. I don't want to go through a presentation without acknowledging them. And with that, I will take the questions that you have.
Thank you very much. It's really interesting. I found myself trying to figure out when I thought that last video you saw. I'm not sure. I thought they were, yes, that one. I was like, I didn't see, maybe it's because the video is smaller, but I was like, where are the clues that that person's going to walk into my lane? Because I perceive them as walking straight down the road until almost that last second.
Yeah, what's interesting about this research too is you see a lot of variability in actually the way that humans interpret the interaction. And actually that uncertainty is very important for how we communicate to users about what the automation is doing. Because if people are really uncertain, but the automation has already figured out that they're going to cross or something, it's really important to let people know ahead of time what the vehicle is going to do.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also liked the contrast that you made with human compatible, which is not the same as human like. And then you said because humans, engage in distracting activities, and perhaps you didn't say this, but I was saying perhaps get drowsy or otherwise operate vehicles when they're impaired. And I like that distinction a lot about the compatible rather than human-like.
Yeah, I won't take full credit for that because it's actually from a popular book now by Stuart Russell, but I think it really captures, in fact, that we can enhance the traffic system with automation in some ways. Of course, as Dan was saying, that's far off, but in some ways we want to be extra human, right? We want to perform these tasks better than people would.
Yeah. Thank you. And I see Jody's got her hand up, so I'm going to let Jody ask the question.
Hi, Josh. Thanks. That was a really interesting talk. I'm Jody Plummert, and I co-direct the Hank Virtual Environments Lab here at Iowa with Joe Carney in computer science. And we worked with Rini on a project with Toyota on the adaptive headlamp system. But I want to ask you kind of a different question and kind of get your thoughts on, so part of what you're showing seems to be kind of like a machine learning AI approach, feed as many examples into the system so that they kind of know what all the possibilities are of how a pedestrian or a bicyclist or scooter might react. But the other kind of this algorithm approach sounds like a little bit more feed the rules into the system so that it knows how the pedestrians might respond, et cetera. So I was just curious about your thoughts on, those approaches and how do you think we're really actually going to solve this problem? Because you are right that these situations are very complicated, especially when you've got multiple actors in there and lots of traffic and the environment and everything.
Yeah, I guess what I'll say is that it's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse from the AI standpoint, but like there's a couple of different philosophies right now on how systems are developed. There's sort of an end-to-end deep learning perspective, and then there's one where perception is done at a deep learning level, and then control is a little bit more modeled and that sort of thing. And generally my perspective is that I think that these creating explicit, very interpretable models of human behavior is necessary for these systems, especially as we need to evaluate the safety implications of them. Of course, there's different ways to assess safety as well, but generally my perspective is like, how can we create models and then use those models in some of the control decisions that we make that maybe capture some level of uncertainty also.
So then that makes me wonder, so are your models probabilistic? Because one of the things, like, in these situations, you are really trying to decide on a probabilistic level, how likely is it that this person is going to do this, and the model, would asymptote at some point of like, yes, the person's definitely going to do this, and then there are times where there's a lot of uncertainty and indecision in the model.
Yeah, so that's actually a challenge that I'm struggling with right now. There's a dynamic modeling technique that I use it's a Markov process sort of thing. But essentially it gives you, it fits differential equations based on some features that you feed into it. But one of the challenges of that, of course, is if you have 100 examples, it sort of fits a unique model to each example. And actually what I'm struggling with right now is trying to figure out, and these are models of how the vehicle should stop based on the anticipated pedestrian behavior. One of the challenges right now is actually trying to figure out how to take those 155 models that I think that I have and come up with basically what's the equivalent of a safe driver. You know, presumably it would fail in some cases, like you're talking about probabilistically, but I haven't even gotten to the point where I've identified a clear model that can work in a range of scenarios yet.
Yeah, it's a very hard problem.
Yeah.
Muted. Laura posted a question in the chat. She asked, do you know, she said, great videos and research insights. Do you know if any of the video data can be made open source for secondary research?
Yeah, so generally for most of the research partners that we have, the video can't be released, but some of the time series data can. And I know that's a huge limitation, but there's, especially some of the MIT work is part of a larger consortium that kind of controls that.
Okay. Thank you. And I see that Chris Schwartz has his hand up. Thank you, Chris. I'm going to let you ask yours.
Thank you, Dawn. Hi, Josh.
Hi.
Great presentation. I think one of the remarkable things about these crossings is that the pedestrian rarely ever looks at the driver once they're, you know, going. And so I wonder if you can speak to, when does the communication happen between the two, or does it? Maybe it doesn't sometimes. Yeah.
So there's about a handful of studies at this point, including naturalistic data at the University of Leeds and throughout Europe, and in some of our own research, that basically we find it extremely difficult to find pedestrians that wave their hands or other things. It's actually surprisingly low rates of direct communication, especially in university towns. You find people just kind of walking across because they've already figured out that it's safe. But one of the interesting things about some of the early work with MIT that we did was that we actually found that the signifier of somebody crossing was that they would look away from our vehicle. So when they were about, and this is, I think most people think, oh yeah, I make eye contact, and that's probably true to some extent, but it's actually the look away as some sort of communication compact where they're like, well, I'm going to check the other lane and then I'm going to go. So it's one of those features of these interactions. It's kind of interesting.
Yeah, that is. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so I think we'll keep moving. Thank you, Josh. That was really interesting. So next we have Laura Sand. Dr. Sand has been with the University of North Carolina Highway Safety Research Center since 2004 and is active in a variety of research areas, including the development and evaluation of community-involved health and injury prevention programs, and studies focusing on pedestrian and bicycle safety, mobility, and access. She serves as the director for the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center, a federal clearinghouse of pedestrian and bicycle-related training materials and resources. She also serves as the director for the Collaborative Sciences Center for Road Safety, a National University Transportation Center funded in 2016 by the US DOT. And the mission of that center is to advance transportation safety through a multidisciplinary systems-based approach. And with that, I will welcome Laura and hand the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And I'm having a little bit of connectivity issues today, so I may go off camera during the presentation and hope that that makes things a little bit more smooth on my end. But can you see everything so far?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Well, Dan started this plenary off by talking about going back to our roots and our fundamentals. And for me as a researcher, one of those fundamentals is the data that I look to and that I use in my research and that I try to improve. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about just the perspectives on the data that we have and we're using as we think about some of these emerging issues that the other panelists have shared already. And as Dawn mentioned, a lot of my work revolves around thinking about people who are outside of the vehicles, who are walking or biking, or increasingly might be using a form of micromobility. And one of the things that we've learned in studying these people outside the vehicle is that even though people who drive often also walk and use these modes, people who walk or don't drive can be very different. In particular, we have a lot of folks in our population, including children, people who can't have a license, who have lost a license. Maybe they've lost the ability to drive because of dementia or other age-related situations. We have a lot of folks living now, an increasing number with physical and cognitive limitations, as well as folks who simply can't afford car ownership, usage, rental, or subscriptions. And one of the things that we've learned about these people who don't drive are that they're more likely to be women, children, seniors, and folks who have lower incomes or maybe members of racialized communities. So even though we all have travel needs, we might all be given slightly different choices in how we move around. And in the last decade, we've talked a whole lot about the increase in crashes involving vulnerable road users. Specifically, pedestrian crashes have really, and fatalities have been, hitting record levels in the last 30 years. But what we don't talk about enough is why these people are made vulnerable. And often we don't make it explicit that they are made vulnerable when they're trying to use auto-oriented environments that are really exclusively designed for the use of automobiles and really fail to provide access to the places and services that they need, as well as protection from a variety of risks. And one of the things that we've also been having a lot more conversations around lately is what are these, how are these vulnerabilities distributed? We've talked about health disparities for a really long time, but I think really the transportation field is still developing its vocabulary around what it means to be transportation disadvantaged, and what systematic racism even looks like in the transportation context. But we're starting to get some better data and see some research coming out, and this is just one example that I've highlighted as a visual example. This is a historical map showing the redlining policy in Los Angeles. And you can see the housing blocks that are colored in yellow and red are predominantly where people of color lived. And in this policy, they were deemed the least desirable neighborhoods of the community. And therefore, they were systematically denied loans for their houses, and their housing value assessments were lower. And over the course of years, you can actually compare this to where we are now with the Vision Zero plans for the city. And if you look at the lines that are showed kind of in that pinkish red color, that's the city's map of their high injury network. So the widest roads, the fastest moving traffic is not really discoupled at all from where those areas of historical disinvestment are. And so we're really starting to appreciate not only the choices people are given to travel, but the choices people are given to live, and how we are acknowledging these disparities in our data sets. And while we've made a lot of really good progress with our human factors researchers, with our social science, with our psychologists, with our epidemiologists, we still see that our data sources, our data systems that drive our research are inherently not distributed equally. We know a whole lot more about vehicles than we actually do about people, and in particular, those made most vulnerable by our roadway systems. So for example, if you think about the vehicles that you might be studying in your research, you have pretty good measures, pretty standard measures of where they're allowed to operate. We have standardized vehicle codes. We have the model inventory of roadway elements. We know what kind of roadway features they're on. We know how many miles vehicles are traveling. We have a lot of different ways to estimate that. And we have a lot of simulation tools that have established parameters for understanding how vehicles can be simulated. When we look at the kind of crashworthiness and safety outcomes of vehicles, we have you know, a long history of solid investment in our crash programs looking at vehicles, and that has probably saved countless lives, thinking about how we make our vehicles more crashworthy for the people who occupy them. And we have standardized tools for understanding the number of crashes involving vehicles. Even if a crash involves no injury to an occupant, if there's at least $1,000 worth of damage, police are required to submit a crash report. So we know a lot about a lot of different features of vehicles. But a lot of my research is not involving vehicles, it's involving the people that use the roadways and share that space sometimes with vehicles. And as Josh pointed out, it's a much different and more complex operating environment. We have very poor measures of exposure to risk. One of our studies is pedbikeData.org. We tried to compile all the data sets of pedestrian injury data, count data, and roadway inventory data. And you can see it's a wild mishmash of data sources. There's not a lot of standardization, and really this kind of prohibits you from looking beyond a very small individualized region that might have done a good job investing in their data systems. And so, you know, when we start to try to understand population level travel behaviors, it's really challenging. And Josh's research was fantastic in showing the work that's being done as we actually start to use the technologies to look at naturalistic walking and biking and scooting environments. But we're decades behind where we've been with the naturalistic driving data that really didn't intentionally sample pedestrians or bicyclists in any systematic way. And in terms of crashworthiness, you know, I'm in the public health field working with a lot of epidemiologists. We've started to learn a whole lot about our human bodies and how they're changing over the decades, and what obesity and dementia and diabetes and stroke and heart disease have done in terms of our ability to survive crashes at different speeds. So we have a lot of interesting and important clinical research that's available, but almost none of that is really being tapped into right now in the transportation or, you know, safety simulation fields. We're still really relying on our built environment data to help us predict crashes and crash severity, and really doing very little to incorporate the health data that we have. And in terms of that health data, we also are kind of realizing that our crash data that is so vehicle oriented is only skimming the surface of what we know about crash outcomes for people. So we don't capture any injury that doesn't involve a vehicle. And so if you're a person who bikes and your wheel gets stuck in a bike or in a railroad or a streetcar, and you have a crash as a result, or if you're a pedestrian and you trip on a poorly designed curb or roadway surface or poorly maintained sidewalk, we're capturing that data in the hospital records, but it's never used to improve our built environments. And so, you know, with all this information that we're lacking, we still know one really fundamental truth, and it's that people use the transportation environment very differently than vehicles. Vehicles go through a traffic space to get from A to Z with goods or people inside. People sometimes do want to go as quickly as possible from A to Z, but many times they're using the roadway space in very different ways than cars and vehicles and even automated vehicles. So you can see that, we've seen that in recent years when people are using their streets as social protest, as social engagement, when we see people use sidewalks and other public spaces to gather and to be with their community members. You see that when children socialize with their peers on their way to school, and when people stop and gather and want to experience a space rather than travel through it. We also see that the road serves very important recreational reasons, which we see more during COVID than we ever saw before. People wanting to use the roadway network to socialize for health purposes and even to raise money for important causes. And so one of the things that we've been trying to point out is that a lot of our transportation studies assume that maximizing efficiency of vehicle throughput or AV delay is, one of the biggest factor to take into account. But they are really inherently under measuring and even devaluing all the different ways that people can and do want to use the roads. And so we really need to get better at measuring these other ways that people want to use spaces and incorporating those into our models rather than just assume that the vehicle purpose of the infrastructure is the same as the human purpose. So this is actually an artist that I was introduced to very recently. This is Mimi Onyuoha. She's a Nigerian-American artist who's doing work and research to really highlight the social relationships and the power dynamics behind data collection. And one of the things that she says on her website, which I encourage everybody to check out, is that which we ignore reveals more than what we give our attention to. So the spots left blank reveal our hidden social biases and indifferences. And she's really inspired me to think a lot about the data systems that we have and the data systems that we don't have, and to get a little bit more philosophical in asking, why do we have such complete data on miles of highway and the cost of vehicle congestion, but such incomplete data on where people fall and how long recovery times are from a crash? And why do we not know where the people are whose transportation needs are unmet? Why do we not know enough about premature mortality that's caused by our roadway policies that don't support physical activity? Why do we have such a great NDS sample on drivers? But as others have noted, we have a real challenge in pulling out enough data cases to look at pedestrians and bicyclists. So as we think about our missing data, it's really important in this time when we're starting to embrace more of the safe systems dialogue, because the safe systems discussion talks about centering the human, to understand the limitations and the needs of humans, and recognizing the way that our data can help make safer environments that mitigate risk for all humans. And so when we're talking about safe systems, we have to also be talking about our data sets and the ways in which they systematically exclude important information about people that we really need to enhance safety in our communities. And at the same time, I think we have to be really careful when we talk about how we study humans, because we do see in many cases a history of more extractive and oppressive practices, and a reliance upon surveillance techniques that can be very harmful and violating. So centering the human in this work doesn't mean necessarily gathering more data about a group, but really engaging the people in the communities as active participants and creators and owners of the data that are needed to inform transportation policy. So really centering the human in our research requires us to think about some of the power dynamics in our research and our processes, and think about who is allowed to participate and share their data, and who is excluded, and who is not represented in the data that we're using. And I think we were just talking a little bit about, when we train our AI data sets, what are our training data sets based upon? There are so many, we could have an entire discussion about what pedestrians and bicyclists are represented in those training data sets, and how quickly the pedestrian and bicycle infrastructure changes are happening in many communities that those training data sets are never going to keep up with. But we're also seeing some really exciting examples of data democratization, where we're not simply relying on privatized data sources that are being sold to agencies and researchers, but we're seeing a drive for community engaged research. This is just one example that I've come across where a nonpartisan group of civic community members is coming together and mapping the crashes involving pedestrians in their city that haven't been captured by their official reports. So there's some really good examples, and I think just my call to action for the UTC researchers at large is that we continue to think about our own research, the people who are involved in collecting the data, and put on that people first focus. And I think the keynote speaker yesterday was fantastic in issuing the call for collaboration to bring in complementary perspectives. I think data feminists, social justice groups, historians, population health geographers, there's a lot of folks out there working with different forms of what you might call data that can be really important for our work in looking at AV safety. And for looking at just the broader impacts of these technologies on our society. And as we continue to work with our research sponsors, it's also important to recognize that data come at a cost. They are an investment, and who we involve in the data collection is, and who we invest in our data to collect data around is really a reflection of our research priorities. So let those priorities and those issues be known. So that's all I had to say, but thank you so much. This has been a really great and eye-opening conversation.
Wow, thank you, Laura. I find this really thought-provoking as someone who's a researcher, and of course most of my research is from the vehicle point of view, but how can we center the human even when we're looking at human machine interactions rather than centering the machine? And do I have a blind, I know I have a blind spot, we all have blind spots everywhere, but what are my blind spots when I form my research question? Thank you. And I was wondering, while other people are thinking about their questions, do you have advice for people who have spent their careers looking at the machine and basically how humans interact with the machine rather than looking at humans and how those machines might interact with humans? Anyway, can you name some blind spots?
You're right. I mean, and we all have blind spots. I have no insight on how humans inside the vehicle are interacting with those machines. But I do think that, one of the more common errors that I see in the papers that I review is this sort of simple assumption that we can swap out, in our simulation model, we can swap out a vehicle and we can make it smaller and slower, and it's going to, be a good fit for modeling the pedestrian. That's problematic for so many reasons. But I think also, we see a lot of research that is very dehumanizing. They label pedestrians as objects or hazards. And this language use, again, it shows that default bias that the goal is to move this machine through space, as opposed to understand how the machine might be a tool to meet the community's transportation needs. Mm-hmm. So I think that fundamental conversation about where our community's transportation needs unmet really has to happen before we can ever decide what the value of the vehicle and the technology is. Because in a lot of cases, we tend to just promote this kind of techno-heroic narrative about the AVs helping people get across the street or do this or that or get to where they can't drive. But I think those assumptions really need to be questioned, and questioned with the communities that have been marginalized at the table.
Thank you. And I see Dan and then Joe both turn their video on, so I'll hand it over to them.
Thanks, Laura. Excellent presentation. Equity in transportation is something that I worry about greatly in the future, but I think just as a comment, in Iowa City, which is, not a huge city, but we do have a 6-day bus service, but it shuts down for the overnight shifts. One, we talk about automated Ubers and access to that kind of technology, but one thing that has been piloted in some places is a doorstep to doorstep Uber or Lyft or whatever ride-hailing company you pick. That cities actually can save considerable money by giving those point-to-point vouchers, right, from their home to their work for off-hours transportation. I think it's a good opportunity to understand how that works in the manual driving world. I'm tend to be a bit cynical about how far off point-to-point automated robot ride-hailing is coming, but I think in the meantime, we should really talk up that kind of access to transportation today, because we can do that today, and the sooner the better.
Yeah, and these, travel behaviors are so dynamic, and we often think in such linear ways that if we do A, it'll result in B, and we don't always complete the loop on how, how these options that we provide are very interrelated. When transit service gets worse, people have to drive, but if transit service is improved and people are provided ways to get to transit, you can change behaviors that will maybe have nonlinear effects over time. And so our models are still very simplistic, as models have to be, but we also have a lot of really good system science literature and agent-based modeling and other systems dynamics models that can help us to start to play out how these changes in choices that we give to people can change over time too. So I can send an example from one of our CSCRS studies where we were looking at congestion pricing, because it was seeing how changes in our investment in transit relate to where and how often people drive, as well as how often they walk, how often they're exposed, and how their crash rates may change. So yeah, it's a great.
Thank you.
Great talk, Laura. Really, really good. One of the things you said that I thought was really interesting was pointing out the differences in the way non-drivers use the transportation road network. And one of the things that I think was exciting during COVID was the reimagination of how to use roads, shutting down roads for people to ride bikes and to walk on weekends and at other times of day. And, one of the things I'm hoping is that persists. And what I don't know is who is it who's documenting what the positive side effects of this are in changing behavior, and what the positive outcomes are to help inform planners and such, what the advantages are to these reuses.
That is a great question. And I can tell you one of our UTC projects is looking exactly at that issue. We created an open source data set on street reimagination projects that have happened during COVID. I can put in the link if I can find it. It's no longer on our homepage. But one of the projects is creating an equity framework to evaluate what's gone into that data set, which now has recorded, I think, more than 1,300 examples of street kind of reimagination projects. And it's created a categorization network, so you can look at projects that lowered speeds, or that created streeteries, or that created some other form of, separated travel space. And so now that we have this data set that has been crowdsourced, we're starting to use it for evaluation purposes to see what was the process behind this change. Was it equitable? Did it, how is it being measured over time? And we can kind of begin to track the outcomes of those projects better.
Good, very cool.
Yeah, it is. I think it's a great natural experiment for us all to be doing right now.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can find it.
Thank you. Are there any more questions for Laura, or did anyone have any questions they'd like to pose to another panel member or more than one panel member? Or even some concluding thoughts that you'd like to share?
Laura, I just thought your talk was really interesting, and it reminds me, Joe and I once went and talked to the Iowa City Council about our work on pedestrians and bicyclists, because they were interested in making changes to roadways in the city to make it more friendly for bikes and pedestrians. And one of the things that was pointed out is that there are these sort of like several two-lane, one-way roads through town that were designed to get cars quickly across town, but they're terrible for pedestrians and bicyclists. And they have now changed at least one of them, maybe a couple of them, into two opposing traffic streets. And it's just interesting because it kind of follows along more universal design principles, that when you make changes that are good for vulnerable groups, sometimes that, or often, it's good for everyone, and I think that even though maybe, I don't know, it's sort of like this question of like, can we coexist peacefully with cars or something? Because they, as you pointed out, it's like everything was just so, vehicle centric in the way, and they're talking about that on the news all the time about, highways that were put through neighborhoods and all of that kind of stuff. So it's very timely, I think, and interesting.
Yeah, we are all interconnected. I mean, that's what the pandemic has shown us so clearly too. You can't have a crisis happening around the world that doesn't come home to us as well. And you can't have inequities and poverty and pain in your own backyard that doesn't somehow affect you. And so addressing those vulnerabilities and helping the people who are least accessing safety does, we call it sometimes the curb cut effect. It's when you put in a curb cut that serves a person in a wheelchair, you're also serving the mother with a stroller and anybody else who needs to, get over that hump. So yeah. I'll have to follow up with my COVID streets database.